Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you've all been well. Tonight we begin with the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of the Bedouins, the desert nomads who managed to survive in places so hot that even the sun seemed to take breaks out of pity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you've ever thought your summer vacation was too hot, congratulations. You've never met the Arabian desert. This isn't your sunburn from a beach chair kind of heat. This is heat that could melt your sandals while you're still wearing them. The kind of heat that makes air itself feel personal. You don't walk in this heat. You negotiate with it. And the sand. Oh, it's not just hot. It's vindictive. It's in your shoes, your food, your ears, and somehow in your soul. But for the Bedouins, nomadic Arab tribes who called this furnace home, this wasn't punishment, it was just Tuesday. The Arabian desert, particularly the Rub al-Khali or empty quarter, is one of the most inhospitable places on earth. And yet Bedouins manage to raise families, herd animals, and drink tea in it, tea in 45 degrees heat. Meanwhile, most of us get cranky if the air conditioning breaks for more than 4 minutes. So, how did they do it? They didn't rely on fancy gear or climate-controlled shelters. They had no cooling towels, smart watches, or filtered water bottles named after mountains. What they had was a deep generational understanding of the desert's rhythms and an impressive tolerance for discomfort. To them, the desert wasn't an enemy to fight. It was more like a very strict landlord. You respected it, followed the rules, and in return, it might let you live. The Bedouins' entire way of life was engineered for survival. From their breathable black goat hair tents to their carefully timed daily routines, everything had a purpose. No movement was wasted. No drop of water was taken for granted. You'd never catch a Bedouin power walking at noon just to hit a step goal. That kind of behavior gets you turned into a cautionary tale, their secret weapon adaptation, not the shiny app updating kind, but the dusty, sun-beaten, trial by fire kind that comes from generations of learning what works and what gets you cooked like a lamb kebab. In the desert, shade isn't just nice, it's essential. It's not, oh, this is pleasant kind of shade. It's thank you for not dying here kind of shade. If you've never stood under a palm tree in 118 degrees and felt your soul slowly reattach to your body, then you've never truly understood gratitude. The Bedouins, of course, mastered the art of chasing, creating, and preserving shade like it was treasure, because it was forget beachfront property. In the Arabian desert, real estate value is measured in square inches of darkness. Their first line of defense, the Beit al-Shar or House of Hair, and yes, that's as literal as it sounds. These tents were woven from goat hair, which through some miracle of desert engineering, expanded when wet, rare, but helpful during sudden rain, and stayed breathable when dry. It was climate control before Vic, and with far fewer complaints to the landlord. The tents were mobile, of course, because you never know when the desert will suddenly decide your neighborhood is now a hot plate. But they weren't just dragged anywhere. Bedouins positioned them strategically, always keeping in mind the wind direction, the sun's angle, and the location of the one lone tree in a 50-mile radius. And when no goat hair tent was available, improvisation kicked in. Camels made excellent shade providers, big, tall, and relatively immobile when chewing cud. A Bedouin might rest in a camel's shadow, or, in more desperate moments, just dig a shallow trench and lie in it like a sandworm with style. Even small rocks, dune shadows, or saddle bags became tools in the shade game. The Bedouins didn't waste time hoping for a breeze. They built their own microclimates with whatever they had. Shade wasn't luck, it was strategy. Now let's unravel the enigma of the black goat hair tent, a marvel of nomadic engineering that kept the Bedouins shaded for millennia. First off, the color, black. You'd think white would be the obvious choice in a heat oven, but black absorbs the heat from the sun and radiates it back out, making the inside of the tent several degrees cooler than the outside. Coupled with the fact that goat hair fibers expand when wet, this tent design became a marvel of passive cooling. The downside, though, condensation. As the cool air inside the tent meets the hot air outside, it forms a tasty treat for moisture-loving microbes, turning the tent into a cozy greenhouse. Without proper ventilation, the air inside could quickly become thick, stale and ripe for all sorts of unpleasant surprises. Imagine the worst air quality day you've ever seen, then add a dash of mold spores and a pinch of stale camel hair. But the Bedouins, being the ingenious nomads that they are, found ways around this. See, the tent's entrance was designed to keep the worst of the heat out and the air flow in. It hung low, blocking direct sunlight and any curious jackals from wandering in. Plus, it allowed for a cross breeze to keep the air moving, preventing the buildup of that super concentrated, super gross air. Ventilation was key, but the Bedouins also had some old-school tricks up their sleeves. For instance, the trusty wine scoop, basically a funnel that draws in fresh air from below the tent. Then there were the air vents, cleverly placed near the top of the tent, letting hot air escape without letting in pesky insects. And if things got really stuffy, they had the trick of throwing sand onto the roof of the tent. The coarse sand absorbed the heat from the fine hair fibers, redistributing the warmth and hopefully not suffocating anyone in the process. But it was a double-edged sword, keeping the tent cool enough to stay alive, but not so chilly you need a camel coat. The Bedouins struck a balance with the elements that most of us wouldn't last 5 minutes in. Their mastery over a harsh environment is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and adaptation. So the next time you're feeling a little too hot or a little too bored with your life, just remember the Bedouins in their black tents in the middle of a searing desert. Now that's a shade story worth telling. And here's a look at a traditional Bedouin tent, also known as a Beit al-Shar. These tents are made from goat hair, which provides insulation against the scorching sun and the cold desert nights. Notice the low-hanging entrance, which helps keep the interior cool and also doubles as a security feature. Inside the tent, you'll find various compartments for sleeping, cooking, and storing supplies. Despite the harsh conditions, life in a Bedouin tent was surprisingly comfortable. Families would gather inside to eat, socialize, and tell stories. The tents were also portable, allowing the Bedouin tribes to move with their herds and follow seasonal migration patterns. Today, Bedouin tents continue to be used in many parts of the Middle East, offering a glimpse into a rich cultural heritage that has thrived in one of the world's most challenging environments. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Extraordinary People. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with others. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. And as always, feel free to drop your thoughts, suggestions, or video requests in the comments section below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world.
Up. Closing the weave and keeping water out. It's like automatic tent insurance with zero paperwork. This dual-purpose miracle fabric meant that the tent stayed cool and breezy during the day and dry and cozy when the rare storm hit. And because the desert cools rapidly at night, like a microwave that shuts off mid-cycle, the thick black material helped trap what little heat was left. But it's not just about the fabric. It's the design, too. These tents were low, wind-resistant, and could be assembled and disassembled faster than a modern pop-up gazebo by people who were likely also wrangling camels and keeping small children from wandering into sand dunes. The inside was divided by gender and function. One side for men and guests, another for women and family life. And while the tent was open at the sides to let air flow, cloth panels could be dropped in a flash when a sandstorm came knocking. Bedouins were masters of comfort within extreme limits, sort of like camping if your campground were actively trying to murder you. So no, it wasn't a palace, but in a place where the environment is actively hostile to human existence. A goat hair tent was both refuge and fortress. Now, let's address a question every tourist has asked in the desert. While wearing shorts and rapidly turning into a rotisserie chicken, why are they wearing all those clothes? All welcome to the Bedouin robe, also known as the disher th or galaba, depending on the region. To the untrained eye, it may look like someone gave up on tailoring, but to the Bedouins, it's a thermal regulation masterpiece, carefully designed to outwit one of the most relentless suns on Earth. First, the fabric, usually light-colored cotton or linen. Not thick, not heavy, but loose and billowing, creating a layer of air between skin and heat, like having a personal breeze trapped under your clothes. And unlike your unfortunate tank top, it actually protects the skin from direct sunlight. Think of it as wearing your own shade. While most people in the desert are trying to sweat less, Bedouins let the sweat happen because as it evaporates under those layers, it cools the body more efficiently than any desperate blast from a handheld fan. Bonus, it keeps sand from rubbing your legs raw, because nothing ruins a romantic camel ride like exfoliation by wind. Their headwear, like the khair or shimar, isn't just fashion either. It's a portable shelter wrapped around the head and face. It shields from sun, dust, and sandstorms. It's adaptable, breathable, and stylish. In a yes, I might own a dagger and a deep understanding of the desert kind of way. Even the colors matter. White reflects sunlight. Black is actually used for tents more than clothing, although some tribes did wear darker hues in winter. But trust me, no one's wearing neon activewear out there unless they're trying to get spotted by satellites. If you think waking up early is tough, try doing it because the sun is actively plotting your destruction. The Bedouins weren't morning people by preference. They were morning people by survival strategy. In the desert, timing is everything. The heat doesn't ramp up gently. It slaps you across the face sometime after 9 o'clock a.m. and doesn't let up until sunset. So, Bedouins became masters of desert scheduling, rising before dawn to travel, rest during the inferno hours of midday, and continue again in the cooler twilight. Modern tourists call this siesta. Bedouins call it not dying on the road. They didn't march across dunes at noon just to prove a point. That's how you end up dizzy, dehydrated, and hallucinating mirages that try to sell you bottled water. Instead, they'd set up camp, find shade, sip tea. Yes, hot tea. We'll get to that and let the sun do its worst while they quietly ignored it. Even the camels knew the drill. No panicked galloping. No dramatic desert sprints, just calm, steady pacing like they were strolling to a mildly urgent appointment. There was no prize for speed, only for not collapsing face first into sand, and then there's navigation. Traveling early or late means knowing where you're going when everything looks the same. Bedouins didn't use compasses. They used stars, shadows, and a memory so sharp it could probably recite dune patterns by name. They knew how to avoid rocky valleys that trapped heat, where the sand was softest, and which terrain was more slow bake versus deep fry. They knew when to detour, when to climb, and when to say, "Nope, not today," and waited out under a goat hair tent. 2. Outsiders, their pace looked slow, but in reality, it was the rhythm of survival. Rushing meant sweating more, losing water faster, and risking heat stroke. Steady movement meant you made it to the next well, village, or shady tree with enough energy to actually enjoy being alive. You can't talk about Bedouin survival without addressing the real star of the show, the camel. These beasts didn't just survive the desert. They made it look easy. Camels are like the desert edition of a Swiss army. Knife, transportation, shay, milk factory, early warning system, and occasional attitude problem, all wrapped in a furry, knobbly package. To the untrained eye, camels appear grumpy, lopsided, and mildly inconvenienced by existence. But to the Bedouins, they were life partners. A Bedouin without a camel was just a guy standing in a heat wave wondering why his feet hurt. First of all, camels can go days, sometimes weeks, without water. This isn't a party trick. It's an evolutionary superpower. Their bodies store fat in their humps, not water, contrary to popular belief. And they regulate sweat better than most fitness influencers. While you're melting under the sun like a cheap popsicle, camels are strolling past with an expression that basically says amateur. Their feet massive and padded, perfect for walking across hot sand without sinking in or sizzling like bacon. Their nostrils, they can close them during sandstorms. That's right. Camels can literally shut out the desert. Try doing that with your local pollen count. And their milk, nutrient-rich, slightly salty, and consume even when there's no refrigeration in sight. It was breakfast, lunch, and electrolyte replacement therapy. Al-Anon. Bedouins used camels not just to carry supplies, but also to locate water. These animals had a sixth sense for survival. If a camel suddenly perked up and turned left, you followed, even if your internal GPS disagreed. But owning a camel wasn't like having a pet. It was more like having a temperamental coworker who occasionally spits at you, but can also save your life. The Bedouins respected their camels, talked to them, named them, and treated them better than some modern folks treat their internet routers. Picture this. It's midday in the desert. The sun is hanging overhead like a heat lamp from a particularly angry god. Your sweat is sweating. Logic says, water, ice, something cold, please. But the Bedouin responds, let's have some piping hot tea. Yes, you heard that right. In the middle of an oven made of sand and regret, the Bedouins drank boiling hot tea, and not as some ironic joke. It was an actual survival strategy, a thermodynamic plot twist that would baffle your average air-conditioned Westerner. Here's the logic, and it's backed by both tradition and physics. Drinking hot liquid signals your body to cool itself down. You begin sweating, which is your natural air conditioning system. And when that sweat evaporates in the dry desert air, it cools the body far more effectively than chugging cold water and waiting for your internal organs to do something useful. Also, unlike cold water, which can give you cramps and make you feel bloated when you're already dehydrated, tea goes down smooth and encourages measured hydration. Sip by sip, no guzzling, no brain freeze. Just calm efficiency with a touch of elegance. And it wasn't just tea. Sometimes it was salted tea or herbal infusions made from local desert plants. Things like sage or chamomile. These weren't luxury blends from a high-end boutique. They were practical concoctions that replaced electrolytes and soothed the gut. Especially useful when your kitchen was a campfire and your fridge was a rock. Tea was more than hydration. It was ritual. The desert has a way of stripping life down to the essentials. And the tea circle was one of the few luxuries the Bedouins kept. Hospitality, storytelling, trade negotiations. It all happened over hot cups and clinking spoons. And in a world where survival meant embracing discomfort and mastering your own body heat, the act of sipping tea under a blazing sun wasn't madness. It was control, dignity, a little middle finger to the sun. In the desert, water isn't a casual refreshment. It's a VIP guest, a sacred commodity, and occasionally a cause for tribal conflict. While most people today think of water as something that comes out of the fridge in a nice bottle with a mountain on the label, the Bedouins viewed it the way a medieval king viewed gold: precious, guarded, and never wasted. The Bedouins weren't just surviving without abundant water. They were thriving with practically none. And the secret wasn't mystical desert powers. It was meticulous planning and an unbreakable code of respect for water. First off, they knew where to find it. In a landscape that looks like an endless sand-colored photocopy, Bedouins could spot subtle clues. A certain plant, a line of birds, the shape of the terrain, and say, "There's a well over that dune." And 9 times out of 10, they were right. That one time they were wrong. Let's just say it probably ended with a camel giving them the side eye. They dug deep wells, tapped into underground springs, and even captured condensation in cloth overnight. Nothing was wasted. You didn't pour one out for the homies in Bedouin culture unless you really liked them. Drinking water wasn't a free-for-all. It was rationed carefully, especially during travel. You drank just enough, not more. Think hydrated monk, rather than festivalgo with a gallon jug. Over-drinking could actually make you thirstier in the long run by flushing essential salts. Hence, that salty tea from Chapter 7 wasn't just weird, it was strategic. Water also had a powerful social value. Sharing water with travelers was a moral obligation, not a nice gesture. To deny someone water in the desert was basically the nomadic version of slamming the door in a blizzard, and possibly starting a blood feud. Even enemies were often offered water. Before negotiations began, the desert didn't care who you were. Dehydration was famously nonpartisan. Imagine this. You're sitting by your tent, sipping tea, having a calm chat with your camel, when suddenly the horizon vanishes. The sky turns yellowish-brown, and before you can say, "Did someone anger the weather spirits?" you're being violently exfoliated by the wind. Welcome to the charming world of sandstorms, or as Bedouins likely called them, Tuesday. In the desert, sandstorms aren't rare freak events. They're a regular feature of life, like sunburns or unsolicited camel opinions. For most people, a sandstorm would send them into panic mode, screaming about dust in their nostrils and the general unfairness of nature. But for the Bedouins, it was just another situation to outsmart, preferably without losing a goat. The first rule of surviving a sandstorm is don't run around flapping. The Bedouins had a plan, and it started with situational awareness. They could often see a storm coming long before it hit. A strange tint to the light, a sudden shift in wind. That eerie moment when the desert goes to quiet. All warning signs. Next came the tent lockdown. Bedouin tents were open at the sides for airflow. But once a storm kicked up, out came the side flaps. Weighted cloth panels that drop faster than modern blinds in a rental apartment. The goat hair did its job. Scent-resistant, breathable, and somehow always ready. And for those caught in the open, the Kyre headscarf was the unsung hero. In seconds, it became a sandproof face shield wrapped tightly across the mouth, nose, and eyes. Some even carried extra cloth just for emergency wrapping. Think DIY desert hazmat suit, minus the bulk. If absolutely nothing was nearby, a shallow trench in the sand offered temporary shelter. It wasn't glamorous, but neither is inhaling 5 pounds of the Sahara. Bedouins would lie flat, cover up, and wait it out like desert ninjas, but gritty. The storm would pass eventually. Afterward came the dusting off, checking the camels, and maybe a laugh about who got sand in the weirdest place. Spoiler: it's always the ears. To outsiders, sandstorms looked apocalyptic. To Bedouins, just another round of dermatological violence from the sky. But thanks to planning, patience, and practical scarves, they handled it like pros. When you live in an environment where cooking outside is redundant because the sun already does that for you, your food choices become less about flavor, explosions, and more about not exploding from heat exhaustion. The Bedouins knew this better than anyone. Their diet was not designed for indulgence. There were no 7-course meals, no deep-fried novelties, and certainly no midnight snack binges. Mostly because midnight snacks involve firewood. And firewood is rare when the trees gave up centuries ago. Instead, the Bedouin menu was built around 3 things: simplicity, sustainability, and survival. Let's start with the superstar, camel milk. It wasn't just a drink. It was a nutritional Swiss Army knife, full of fat, protein, vitamins, and hydration magic. Camel milk was consumed fresh when possible or fermented into a mildly fizzy yogurt-like drink called lean. Not quite a milkshake, but in 110 Fahrenheit weather, it hit the spot. Dates were another staple. These sugary little energy bombs were lightweight, didn't spoil, and provided potassium, fiber, and a satisfying chew. Like nature's version of trail mix minus the questionable raisins. Bedouins often paired dates with milk, which was pretty much their version of dessert. Sweet, filling, and blessedly not covered in sand. Flatbreads were made when possible, quickly cooked on hot stones or simple pans over the fire. No crusty baguettes out here. Just functional foldable carbs that could double as a plate or a makeshift napkin if things got out of hand. Meat, when eaten, was a rare occasion, usually linked to ceremonies, guests, or when a goat did. Seasoning was mostly salt, maybe, and we're grateful to be eating. Water wasn't gulped during meals. It was strategically sipped, usually after eating. You didn't want to dilute your stomach acids or risk wasting precious fluids on digestion. Yes, even the order of eating was optimized. You'd think after roasting all day, the dessert would cut you some slack at night, but no. The sun might clock out, but the temperature doesn't cool down so much as it plummets, like it tripped over its own robes. For the Bedouins, this meant learning to sleep between 2 extremes. Oven by day, icebox by night. Forget feather beds and memory foam. Comfort was measured by how few bugs you swallow while snoring with your mouth open. During the hotter months, Bedouins slept outside under the stars, sometimes with nothing but a blanket and a prayer. But don't picture a romantic Instagram camping setup. Picture more like Let's lie very still and hope the wind remembers to show up. The trick was to sleep after sunset and before dawn, catching that precious window of relative coolness. The best beds, a soft patch of sand, a saddle bag for a pillow, and your camel parked nearby for security, shade, and moral support. Nothing says sweet dreams like a grumpy animal chewing in the dark. But when it was truly blistering, midday naps became essential, not optional. You didn't push through the heat like some caffeine, chugging office work or trying to impress the boss. You laid down, closed your eyes, and submitted. It wasn't laziness, it was desert logic. In colder months, sleeping inside the goat hair tent became necessary with thick blankets and extra layers. The same tent that breathed in the heat now became a toasty cocoon, unless the wine decided to throw a tantrum and whip sand into your face. Again, there were no bedtimes, only the understanding that sleep happened when it could. And often in shifts, someone had to watch the fire, someone had to watch the animals, someone had to snore loud enough to keep the jackals second-guessing. No clocks, no alarms, just moonlight, instinct, and the occasional cough from a nearby cousin. Let's be honest. Raising kids is hard enough with air conditioning and a fully stocked fridge. Now imagine doing it in the desert where toes are rocks. The playpen is a sand dune, and your toddler's first word might be camel. Bedouin children didn't get childhoods filled with plastic playsets and gluten-free snacks. They got something far more intense. Heat-hardened life training starting roughly 5 minutes after birth. From a young age, Bedouin kids were expected to adapt to the desert, not the other way around. Swaddled tightly in cloth. Yes, like adorable little burritos, they were protected from sun, sand, and unsolicited scorpion interactions. These wraps weren't just for comfort. Sacred. It was strategic. It was the scandal that shook the empire. By the 1550s, the rivalry between Prince Mustafa and Hurrem Sultan had become more than palace gossip. It was a ticking time bomb. Mustafa had grown into a strong, capable leader. He was charismatic, militarily successful, and beloved by the Janissaries. More importantly, many believed he should be the next sultan, and that posed an existential threat, not just to Hurrem, but to her sons. What happened next has divided historians for centuries. Before breakfast, turning someone away could be a death sentence, and no one wanted that kind of karma on their camel. Guests, whether invited, unexpected, or mysteriously vague about their intentions, were always welcomed. The first thing offered, shade. Because in the desert, shade is basically air conditioning with no electricity bill. A guest would be brought under the tent, seated on cushions, and offered water or tea before a single question was asked. You didn't grill them about their business while they were still sweating like a goat in July. Next came the food. Even if supplies were low, a guest was fed dates, flatbread, and sometimes meat, though that was usually reserved for truly special visitors like elders, dignitaries, or your cousin finally returning the camel he borrowed 3 months ago. And then came the tea ceremony, slow, deliberate, and filled with meaningful silences, the clinking of cups, the pouring of hot tea, the passing of the pot. It all created a rhythm like verbal jazz played on a brass kettle. It wasn't just refreshment, it was a diplomatic ritual. Hospitality wasn't limited to just individuals. Entire tribes had reputations based on their generosity. A stingy host could bring shame, while a generous one gained honor, alliances, and probably a few future favors, because the desert always pays back in unexpected ways. And yes, even enemies were sometimes given water and rest with grudges, politely set aside, until at least after the 3rd cup of tea. The code demanded it. After all, you can't feud if everyone's unconscious from heat stroke. To the Bedouins, hospitality was more than manners. It was mutual survival, a shared understanding that the desert didn't care who you were, but a kind host just might save your life, and all it cost was a little water, a little shade, and your best cup of tea. When the sun finally dipped behind the dunes and the desert cooled from lava to toasty rock, it was storytelling time. And no, not the once upon a time kind with dragons and castles. Bedouin stories were gritty, clever, and usually involve someone outwitting a rival with a go and a handful of dates. There were no screens, no subscriptions, no buffering wheel. The Bedouins didn't write things down. Why waste paper you didn't have when you had a brain full of desert legends, tribal lineages, star maps, and jokes that had aged like fine camel cheese? Children learned history not from textbooks, but from grandmothers who could recite entire genealogies backwards while spinning yarn or sipping tea. They knew who betrayed whom 3 generations ago, and they could describe it with dramatic pauses and just enough scandal to keep the kids witty and suspicious of the neighbors. Every tribe had its own library of tales, tales of survival, loss, honor, love, and the occasional poetic revenge. There were heroes, tricksters, wise elders, and cursed wells, all passed down through voice, rhythm, and dramatic eyebrow gestures. And because desert life involved a lot of sitting and waiting for the heat to pass, for the stars to rise, for that stubborn camel to move, stories were the original time filler. No one stared at a glowing screen while ignoring their family. They stared at each other, which was arguably more terrifying. Storytelling also helped preserve survival knowledge. Where to find water, which plants to avoid, how to calm a panicked animal, all wrapped in metaphor, rhyme, and the occasional cautionary tale about a reckless uncle named NASA the Sweaty. The modern world has this charming delusion that nature must be conquered, build higher walls, stronger AC units, thicker sunscreen. But the Bedouins, they understood something far more elegant. You don't fight the desert, you learn its rhythm and walk beside it. For centuries, Bedouin life was built not on opposition, but on adaptation. Instead of paving over the sand, they floated on top of it like surfers of heat and grit. Their tents moved with the seasons, their routines shifted with the sun, and their patience stretched farther than the horizon. They didn't wear black robes in the heat because they were rebelling against common sense. They wore them because airflow matters. Their goats weren't random livestock. They were compact survival machines with hooves. Even their jewelry served functions, sometimes as dowry, sometimes as emergency barter. Nothing was just decoration. It all had purpose. Bedouins didn't curse the sandstorms. They read them. They didn't rush through the day. They paced it. Morning was for movement. Noon was for stillness. Evening was for tea and stories. It wasn't laziness. It was climate literacy. Even their conflicts, fierce as they could be, were handled with layers of honor and negotiation. Because when you live in an unforgiving landscape, burning bridges is a terrible survival strategy. Their understanding of the land was passed not through apps, but through practice. Want to learn where the water hides? Walk with someone older. Want to navigate a moonless night? Watch how the stars shift. No shortcuts, just lived experience and respect. Today, we build deserts into cities and pretend we've won. But the Bedouins would say gently with a knowing smirk that you don't win against the desert, you earn your place in it, one day at a time. So, as the sun sinks and the wind carries the scent of dust and distant tea, remember true survival isn't about resisting nature's power. It's about knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to sit down and sip your tea before the sand decides to join you. Because in the desert, the heat doesn't care about your ego, but it just might respect your humility. She wasn't born into silk sheets or domed palaces. Far from it. Sometime around 1502 in the rugged lands of Rathenia, likely in what is now western Ukraine, a young girl named Alexandra Lysovska lived the simple life of a Christian peasant. Her days were filled with chores, laughter, and the lullabies of the Carpathians. But fate, as it often does in empires, had other plans. Raiders, likely Crimean Tatars allied with the Ottoman slave trade, tore her away from that world before she was old enough to understand just how brutal history could be. Dragged from her village and forced into the long chain of slaves bound for the bustling markets of Istanbul, Alexandra was now property. Her beauty caught the attention of those who trafficked in flesh, but it was something far more dangerous that would soon defy her mind. In the early 16th century, the Ottoman harem wasn't the erotic playground of Hollywood fantasies. It was a political battlefield, and Alexandra, renamed Hurrem, meaning the cheerful one, was about to play the game better than anyone before her. She entered the harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the most powerful man in the Islamic world. He ruled an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia and from the Danube to the Nile. And yet, despite the thousands of concubines and consorts before her, it was this foreign slave girl who would catch his eye and never let go. There are conflicting reports on how exactly she rose. Some say it was her laughter, rare and irreverent, in the shadowed corridors of Topkapi Palace. Others say it was her command of poetry, wit, and language. She was fluent in multiple tongues and knew how to charm, disarm, and enchant. Either way, Suleiman didn't just favor her, he fell for her. But Hurrem didn't come to play the passive muse. Her rise wasn't an accident. It was a masterclass in strategy, timing, and sheer will. She would rewrite the rules of Ottoman court politics, starting with herself. From slave to consort, that was just the beginning. In the world of the Ottoman harem, beauty was fleeting and attention even more so. A girl might catch the Sultan's eye for a week, maybe a month, but then she would vanish into velvet shadows, replaced by the next shimmering novelty. But Hurrem didn't vanish. She lingered, and not by accident. Suleiman, known for his keen intellect and poetic spirit, found an equal in her. They wrote love letters to each other. Yes, actual handwritten poetry draped in metaphors and dripping with longing. She called him her beloved Sultan, and he called her his companion of the soul. This was no casual affair. It was a romance that defied protocol. At this time, Ottoman sultans were not supposed to marry. The imperial harem had a system. A woman bore the sultan a son, and then she was retired to a provincial palace to oversee his upbringing. It prevented any one woman from gaining too much power. That rule, Hurrem shattered it. Not only did she stay in the palace, she gave birth to multiple children, sons and daughters, and never stepped aside. She became his official favorite, then his exclusive partner. And then the unthinkable happened. Suleiman legally married her. That's right. The most powerful Islamic emperor of his time, who had the pick of any concubine, took a former Christian slave girl as his lawful wife. This was the first imperial marriage in centuries. The court was scandalized. The ulama, the religious establishment, grumbled behind their beards. But Suleiman didn't care. Hurrem was now key sultan, the chief consort. She wielded an authority no woman before her ever had. The harem wasn't just a place she lived in. It became her headquarters. Whispers grew louder. Was she manipulating the sultan? Was she whispering into his ear before every major decision? The janissaries, the viziers, even foreign ambassadors took note. Letters and reports began to refer to her as a shadow figure shaping Ottoman policy, and she hadn't even begun her real power moves yet. The harem walls could not contain what Hurrem Sultan was becoming. She wasn't just rewriting palace politics. She was positioning herself at the very heart of empire. In the Ottoman Empire, giving birth to a sultan's son wasn't just a blessing, it was a weapon, and Hürrem knew how to wield it. Her first son, Mehmed, was born not long after she secured Sultan's affection. Then came Rima, her only daughter and closest confidant. Soon followed Salem Bayezid Jahangir. With every birth, her power solidified, each child a pawn on the grand imperial chessboard. But this wasn't just about family, it was about succession and survival. You see, Ottoman succession didn't work like the fairy tale version. There was no clear heir. Instead, it was a brutal winner-takes-all blood sport. When a sultan died, his sons were expected to fight, often literally for the throne, and the losers, they didn't go quietly into exile. They were usually strangled with a silk cord. It was tradition. That meant for Hürrem, the stakes were existential. She wasn't just a mother, she was the general of the faction, fighting to ensure that her son survived the coming storm. And there was one major obstacle: Mustafa, Prince Mustafa Sultan's eldest son from a previous concubine. Mahidevran was beloved by the people, the army, and the court. Charismatic, popular, and competent, he looked like the obvious successor. That made him dangerous to Hürrem and, more importantly, to her children. The rivalry between Hürrem and Mahidevran wasn't some catfight in silks. It was an all-out war. There were physical altercations. It's recorded that Mahidevran once beat Hürrem so badly that she appeared in front of Slian with scratches and bruises. That move backfired. Mahidevran was banished from court, while Hürrem's influence only grew. Behind the scenes, Hürrem played the game. Like a seasoned tactician, she cultivated allies in the court, including the powerful Grand Vizier Rustpara, who would eventually marry her daughter, Mirama. She also began writing letters to foreign rulers, including the Polish king, acting as a diplomat in her own right. And most chilling of all, rumors swirled that Hürrem was plotting Mustafa's downfall. Whether or not she orchestrated it, the seeds were planted. The empire was heading toward a deadly confrontation. Motherhood for Hürrem Sultan was not just sacred, it was strategic. It was the scandal that shook the empire. By the 1550s, the rivalry between Prince Mustafa and Hürrem Sultan had become more than palace gossip. It was a ticking time bomb. Mustafa had grown into a strong, capable leader. He was charismatic, militarily successful, and beloved by the Janissaries. More importantly, many believed he should be the next sultan, and that posed an existential threat, not just to Hürrem, but to her sons. What happened next has divided historians for centuries. According to many accounts, Hürrem and her son-in-law, Rustam Pasha, who conveniently held the position of Grand Vizier, began a slow, deliberate campaign of suspicion. Whispers reached Sulian's ears. Mustafa was plotting to overthrow his father. Letters were forged. Spies were planted. The suggestion was clear: act now or risk betrayal. Sultan, tormented by doubt, summoned Mustafa. During the Persian campaign of 1553, the prince arrived at his father's tent in full ceremonial dress, bowing low in respect. What happened next was not ceremonial. The royal guard seized Mustafa and, in a cold silence, they strangled him with a silk bowring. the traditional execution method for Ottoman royalty. Witnesses said Sulan watched from behind a curtain, his face unreadable. The reaction across the empire was seismic. The Janissaries who adored Mustafa were outraged. The public wept for their fallen prince. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in disbelief, and at the heart of it all, a familiar name surfaced again and again: Hurrem. Whether she orchestrated Mustafa's death or merely benefited from it, her power was now unshakable. Mahidevran, Mustafa's mother, was effectively exiled, living the rest of her life in bitter obscurity. Meanwhile, Hurrem's sons, especially Salem, were now the only viable contenders for the throne. But not all was calm within her own brood. Hurrem's sons fought among themselves, plagued by their own ambitions and insecurities. And Sulan, the Sultan who once wrote, loved poetry and enacted reforms, was becoming colder, more isolated, perhaps haunted by what he had done. Mustafa's death marked the beginning of the end for the idealistic days of Sulan's reign and solidify Hurrem's place in history, not just as a queen, but as a kingmaker, or perhaps a queen slayer. By now, Hurrem Sultan was no longer just the Sultan's favorite. She was the most powerful woman in the empire. But unlike queens in Europe, she didn't sit beside Sulan on the throne. Her influence came from behind embroidered curtains, whispered through silk screens, and penned in coded letters. She was the architect of what would later be called the Sultanate of Women, a political era where imperial mothers, wives, and daughters shaped the Ottoman state. She had already defied centuries of precedent by marrying Sulan, daring him multiple sons, and remaining in the palace. Now she broke another. She moved out of the harem and into the old palace section of Top Capi, closer to the administrative heart of the empire, and dangerously close to the seat of power. From this base, Hurrem acted as an informal advisor. She wrote to foreign monarchs like Sigismund II of Poland, not as a concubine, but as a sovereign partner. Her letters were diplomatic, assertive, and stunningly literate. She wasn't just the power behind the throne, she was a throne of sorts. She also spearheaded public works in Istanbul and Jerusalem: mosques, schools, soup kitchens, hospitals, all stamped with her name. This wasn't just charity. It home calling her the witch, the red-haired devil, the poison of the empire. And yet, they admitted in hushed tones, without her, the Ottoman court would collapse into chaos. She didn't wear a crown, but her shadow fell across the empire like one. And still, time marched forward. Her sons were growing older, tensions rising. The empire she had helped stabilize might soon devour itself from within. And Hurrem, ever the strategist, knew the game wasn't over. Power once gained rarely brings peace. Hurrem Sultan may have vanquished her rivals and secured her position beside Sulan, but the battlefield simply changed shape. Now it was her own sons who stood at the edge of knives and each other. Her eldest, May, once seen as the favored heir, died young under suspicious, though likely natural circumstances. The grief was immense, but there was no time to mourn. The throne had to pass to someone, and that meant the rest of her sons, Salem, Bai, and Chahan, would soon be pitted against one another in a silent, bloodless war that would turn bloody fast. Salem, known more for his drinking than his diplomacy, was not the most inspiring candidate, but he was cautious and obedient, traits Sullen valued. Based, on the other hand, was ambitious, charismatic, and perhaps too much like his late half-brother, Mustafa. That resemblance would prove fatal. Hürrem's letters during this time show a woman trying desperately to balance loyalty, love, and raw political calculus. She tried to keep peace between her sons, encouraging unity, trying to nudge the empire toward a smooth succession. But she knew the truth. Only one could survive. And then there was Cihan, her youngest. Born with a spinal deformity, physically frail, emotionally tender, he was never in the running for the throne. Yet he may have been the one Hürrem loved most. After Mustafa's execution, Cihan reportedly died of heartbreak. Whether that's legend or truth, it added another crack in the already fractured family she'd worked so hard to protect. The death of Mustafa had set a precedent. Fratricide was not just tradition, it was necessary. And now Hürrem was watching her own blood march toward that same inevitable violence. It was a cruel irony. She had spent her life climbing out of powerlessness, only to become trapped in a cycle of blood that no mother could bear. She had built a dynasty, but dynasties are hungry creatures, and in the corridors of Topkapi, where she had once arrived in chains, she now paced in fine silks, still strategizing, still fighting, but for a future she could no longer fully control. Time was slipping, and with it the illusion that anyone in the palace was safe. As the empire trembled under the weight of internal rivalries, Hürrem Sultan turned her eyes to something more enduring than politics, legacy. She had always understood that power was fleeting, but monuments, those could whisper her name long after her enemies turned to dust. So while her sons plotted and Sullen brooded in his increasingly somber court, Hürrem became a patron of public works on a scale few women or men could dream of. She commissioned the Haki Sultan complex in Istanbul, a sprawling architectural marvel that included a mosque, school, hospital, and soup kitchen. It wasn't just a gift to the people, it was a message carved in stone. I was here. I mattered. I served something bigger than court intrigue. She also funded repairs in Jerusalem, helped restore public baths and fountains, and supported charitable endowments that fed and clothed the poor. Every act of generosity was also an act of calculated PR. After all, Hürrem had been slandered endlessly, tainted as a sorceress, a schemer, a foreign seductress who bent a mighty sultan to her will. Her building projects were a counter-narrative, one of grace, service, and piety. And yet, for all the grandeur, she remained controversial. The Ottoman elite never forgave her for upending centuries of tradition. Even ordinary citizens who benefited from her charity debated her intentions. Was she a noble benefactor or a master manipulator? A feminist icon ahead of her time, or a ruthless power broker cloaked in beauty? Even within the palace, her influence had limits. Sullen remained loyal, but increasingly burdened by age, grief, and the failures of his surviving sons. The romantic poetry between them faded, replaced by official matters and bureaucratic fatigue. Still, Hürrem worked until the very end, not just for herself, but for the dynasty she had restructured from within. She wasn't content to be remembered as the Sultan's beloved. She wanted to be remembered as someone who reshaped the very idea of what a woman could be in an empire ruled by men. As time narrowed her world, she ensured the next generation, especially her daughter Mika, would inherit not just jewelry and titles, but a roadmap for power. By the late 1550s, the woman once dragged in chains through the slave markets of Istanbul now lay in silken sheets, surrounded by doctors, attendants, and political whispers. Hürrem Sultan was aging and for the first time in decades no longer the dominant.